Hello, and thank you for joining us today. I'm Eric Leonard from Wiley Ryan, and with me today is my colleague Craig Smith. We are both partners in Wiley Ryan's Government Contracts Group, and we handle a wide range of labor and employment issues for government contractors. We're here today to discuss the new Executive Order 14026 issued on April 27th that will raise the federal contractor minimum wage to $15 per hour effective January 30th, 2022. This is not a surprise if for anyone that's been following developments at the new Biden administration. The $15 minimum wage initiative was part of the first 100-day plan from President Biden. And so we were somewhat expecting an executive order like this to appear. It is part of a broader push for a $15 nationwide minimum wage. But keep in mind, this executive order only applies to federal contracts, and Craig's going to talk a little bit about some of the contracts it applies to, but it is a development that anyone that works in the service or construction field needs to pay attention to, and hopefully we can give you some pointers today on some of the topics and issues we think contractors need to be thinking about right away when it comes to this order. But before we get to that, Craig, explain to us a little bit, how did we get here?
Yeah, thanks, Eric, and hello, everyone. This is a familiar thing, not just as a policy plank, but also it's building on an existing contractor minimum wage. Many of you tuning in today may remember that in 2014, President Obama issued Executive Order 13658, and at the time, that started a minimum wage that applied to contractors, beginning with some new contracts in January 2015. The minimum wage was $10.10 an hour then, and it's increased year by year to where it's now $10.95. The minimum wage covers and has covered in this EO and before contracts that are covered by the Service Contract Act, the Davis-Bacon Act, some additional service contracts that might not be SCA covered. But for those of you who do federally funded construction, it's not the Davis-Bacon related act. So it's only the Davis-Bacon Act itself. And the EO even specifically calls out grants as not subject to the minimum wage. So in a lot of ways, and I think the EO bears this out when you read it, this really reads more like an update that's going to just move the minimum wage, restart it, if you will, from $10.95 to $15 an hour. But while that process might be largely in place and be fairly familiar to contractors, Eric, I think you picked up on a couple things when we were talking about this initially that just suggest contractors do need to definitely be paying attention to some of the compliance and administration issues.
Yeah, earlier I mentioned that although the order was issued on April 27th, the $15 per hour rate is not going to be effective until January 30th, 2022. So there's a pretty large runway there in terms of when we're actually going to see this rate implemented. But there's some language in the executive order that does encourage agencies to incorporate the $15 minimum rate earlier than January 30th, 2022. So what does that mean? If the order isn't supposed to be effective until January 30th, 2022, why would there be early incorporation? And I think the concern with some of the language that at least I have is that this could lead to some confusion amongst agencies and contractors about when the $15 an hour wage rate actually applies, particularly if, let's say, in 2 weeks from now, a contract option is exercised and the new rate or the executive order, the terms of the executive order are put into a contract. We can see how that will cause, or certainly cause, some confusion amongst the contractor and the agency, and then also questions that will come from employees as to why they aren't entitled to receive or are they entitled to receive the $15 an hour minimum wage right away. Keep in mind that Craig mentioned this applies to Service Contract Act covered contracts and Davis-Bacon Act covered contracts, and each of these statutes has a whole set of wage determinations that are maintained by the Department of Labor that have wage rates in them. Most of them have up to 100, 120 labor categories and wage rates that vary by geographic region. So imposing a $15 an hour increase is going to have a big impact and, again, potentially cause confusion amongst contractors as to what rates would apply. generally under the Service Contract Act, when rates change, when there's increases in prevailing wages in a geographic area, contractors are generally entitled to receive a price adjustment to account for that change. FAR has a clause, a price adjustment clause, that addresses these types of changes, and it's generally done at the time of an option exercise. But for SCA covered contractors, early incorporation of the $15 rate may complicate any type of off-cycle attempt to receive a price adjustment, particularly if the incorporation isn't done necessarily with an option exercise. So I think it's really important, if you see a situation where a contracting officer not only incorporates the clause early, but also seeks to enforce it against the contractor, something we think is probably somewhat not supported necessarily by the text of the rule, but again, a possibility you might face. You need to look at that carefully and have a dialogue with your contracting agency to figure out a path forward before you get a complaint from an employee. In the prior rule that Craig mentioned back in 2015, that DOL was thoughtful in how they worded and defined the term new contracts for the minimum wage to be applied to. So we're hoping when rules come or regulations come out eventually that they're equally careful, DOL that is, in the upcoming rulemaking for this new EO, to make sure, again, it's pretty well established and clear as to what contracts it applies and when the actual $15 would take effect if incorporated into a contract. But even just being consistent on those still leaves challenges, right? And I know, Craig, we talked about some other possible challenges we saw with the implementation.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I'd echo, you mentioned just before we get into that, dealing with the SCA, but imagine some of these service contracts that are covered by the EO, but aren't subject to the Service Contract Act. And so there may not be that history buildup on existing contracts or in that contracting office of dealing with price adjustments in these circumstances. So I think everything you just said for that the swath of service contracts that aren't already getting price adjustments, I think the complication is 2x perhaps. But you're right. Even just looking at the history there have been and thinking about how it compares to now, I think there really are going to be some challenges with implementation, particularly when it comes to comparing the minimum wage here at $15 an hour to the prevailing wages that are in those wage determinations that you mentioned, Eric. I mean, think about back in 2015 when the 1010 rate went into effect. At that point, there were some, if you looked for them, labor categories in various parts of the country where in the SCA wage determination that applied there, you'd find people still at $8, $9, $9.50 an hour at some labor categories. But it was a fairly discrete set and a fairly small geographic area. But now I think when you move from just under $11 to 15, that's going to pick up a lot of labor categories throughout the country in states or localities that don't already have a minimum wage in this area, that aren't necessarily in immediate metropolitan areas. But even there may be some that start to get swept up that you wouldn't think of. And Eric, you found, gosh, what was it? A Mississippi county where, 50, 70? I mean, how many labor categories were under $15 an hour in that one?
Yeah, we just took a quick look at, after the rule came out, we looked at Jackson County, Mississippi as an example. And I think there were over 75 labor categories in that Jackson County, Mississippi Service Contract Act wage determination, 75 labor categories that are currently below $15 right now. And there's a host of them that are below $10. And so I think, Craig, you're absolutely right. I mean, the scope of the impact that we're going to see in terms of applying a $15 minimum to existing wage rates, particularly in rural counties and non-large metropolitan areas, it's going to affect a large number of labor categories, not just the one or two or handful of categories that the increase to 1010 may have affected back in 2015. So I think it's going to be a large heavy lift exercise for the Labor Department to sort of manage this and make sure that, again, that the obligations that contractors are undertaking are well defined and not too confusing, at least in terms of conflicts between rates in a wage determination and the $15 rate.
Well, it's funny you mentioned the conflict, and I think that's going to be the real challenge is when DOL started implementing the minimum wage back in 2015, instead of just updating all the prevailing wages in those areas that had folks below $10.10 an hour, instead DOL included a note prominently placed, but it was still a separate note in wage determinations that said there's now under the executive order 13658, there's a $10.10 minimum wage, and they've updated it every year. But at some point, it starts to be where half or some significant portion of the prevailing wages in a wage determination are below that $15 an hour minimum. It starts to just increases, I guess you could say, the opportunities for error, whether it's missing that in proposal pricing for some reason, missing it in hiring because there's just not the right kind of coordination between people familiar with the SCA and the EO obligations versus HR. It can get mixed up in price adjustments with the agencies because while I think agencies are generally aware of the SCA, our experience has been the nuts and bolts experience of contracting offices certainly can vary, understandably so. So it just seems as though the opportunities, not just to do the work, but really the opportunities for this to leave contractors incurring some costs that should be reimbursed from the increase but aren't. It seems like that's a real consideration here and good reason for even contractors that are used to having this minimum wage in their contracts. They really need to be paying attention this time around. And even that, Eric, as you've pointed out, that just is dealing with the people who are going up to $15 an hour. It doesn't even start to contemplate what happens for folks who are already above 15 and the impact that this minimum wage will have on them.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I mean, there's sort of this cascading impact. It's not just having to take up to $15 an hour all the wage rates that are below it, but if you've looked at a typical Service Contract Act wage determination, there's a number of categories that have levels or grades of employees. Like, for instance, you could have a general clerk 1 and a general clerk 2. And I suspect in most geographic regions, general clerk 1s, let's say a general clerk 1 was paid $13 an hour. Well, under this new rule, that general clerk's going to have to come up to $15 an hour. And let's just say the general clerk 2 was originally at $15.25 an hour. Well, they're above the minimum, but the gap that you had between a general clerk 1 and a general clerk 2, which previously would have been $2.25 an hour, now gets shrunk to 25 cents an hour. So it raises the question, is there going to be a need to raise the general clerk 2 rate also in order to avoid sort of a wage compression situation? And that makes it even more of a complicating task for DOL to attack. And that's just one example. I mean, there's a number of different wage categories that have multiple sort of levels and grades of skill that are required to do particular tasks. And if you have, let's say, 4 different grades and you bring the lowest one up by $2 or $3, that's going to have an impact. And not just an impact in terms of trying to come up with the right rate, but impact in terms of employee relations issues and complaints potentially from employees, particularly those in my example, in the general clerk 2, wanting a similar raise that the general clerk 1 got because of the impact of the executive order. And what also makes it even more challenging, I think, for a contractor is the fact that under the Service Contract Act, there's an incentive for contractors to pay only at the actual wage rate in the determination. Yes, it's possible and permissible for a contractor to pay above the wage rate in the determination, but that can have adverse impacts on abilities to collect adjustments down the road when wage rates go up. So there's sort of this difficult dynamic where a contractor may want to pay their general clerk 2 at, let's say, $18 an hour, but if they do that, they may be sacrificing or jeopardizing their ability to get a price adjustment. Price adjustment issues, Craig and I, as you know, Craig, we deal with these on a pretty regular basis.
We do. And I'll tell you, it's interesting because I'm sure some listeners are thinking, I don't have a fixed price or a labor hour contract. I'm cost tight. I'm not too worried about this. But even for a cost reimbursement setting, especially where you're trying to get budget funding and appropriations throughout the year, you have a contracting officer who might say, I understand why you've increased the pay of people to $15 an hour, but not appreciating the reasons. And it can be subtle if you don't study it closely. Why are you moving people who are already above the minimum? What obligation does that minimum have? And I think that really speaks to the need to spend this time between now and January 30th, Eric, and I think you would agree, educating, whether it's internally or customer facing, making sure everyone understands and what the impacts are going to be on their programs and on proposal opportunities.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And I do want to raise just one more issue, and it goes back to this employee relations impact that I just don't know has been fully sort of appreciated yet, is the fact that the higher you make the federal wages without having a similar change on for commercial work, you're creating sort of a larger wage gap between the commercial rates and the federal rates. We have clients where they have individuals that work both commercial and federal work. And if the rate for doing, let's just say you have a janitor that's doing the exact same work, if he's being paid $8 an hour for commercial work, but now it's going to be paid $15 to do the exact same work on a federal project, that's a pretty wide gap. And I can see how that's going to, number one, create strong incentives for folks to start working on the federal projects rather than the commercial ones. But also tension is possible between different employees that, again, either fear they're being underpaid or not treated fairly because they're doing the same work but receiving a payment at a much lower rate. So as you can see, I mean, there's a lot of issues for service and construction contractors to consider well in advance of this new minimum wage going into effect. I hope this was helpful in terms of just trying to flag them so that there's no surprises when ultimately we see this rule be put into place. We have a lot of other collateral and factors that we didn't really get a chance to talk too much about, but things like increasing state minimum wages. I know Virginia just went to $9.50 this past week, and also likely efforts to try to move more broadly toward a nationwide $15 FLSA minimum wage, which we know is a priority of the Biden administration. So these are all other moving parts that we can't predict how they're going to move in the next 8 to 10 months, but they certainly bear watching closely to make sure you remain compliant and don't find yourself having to deal with a Service Contract Act or Davis-Bacon Act audit. We hope this information has been helpful. And of course, we're both here at Wiley Rein to assist with any questions you may have about the new executive order or any government contracts, labor and employment issues you may be facing. So thank you for your time. And thank you, Craig, for joining me today. Take care.